Hello, everyone. I'm Marjorie Sims. I'm Managing Director at Ascend at the Aspen Institute, and it's my honor to be moderating this panel with Claire Minson and Michael Collins. Both of them are very well respected nationally for their work in this area, and I'm delighted to be having this conversation. So I'm going to ask Claire first to share a little bit about her background, and then Michael will share some about his background, and then you'll get a real flavor for the conversation that we'll have. So Claire.
Thanks, Marjorie. I'm super excited to be joining this conversation today. I am Claire Minson. I've been in workforce development for 10 years now, really starting with direct services in Baltimore, working individually with job seekers, predominantly African American and Black job seekers, providing direct training and then connecting to industry sector-based training and working with employers, transitioning there. To then work on workforce strategy with an organization in Baltimore that was very explicit in naming structural racism as a barrier to economic activity and saw the workforce ecosystem as a change lever. And so it was my job to figure out what it meant to use the workforce ecosystem as a lever to really address racism and its impact on economic opportunity for Black people in Baltimore, and then transition there from there to New Orleans to lead the talent and workforce development work at the local economic development agency. And then 2020, summer of 2020 happened, and it really was a choice point for me to decide to lean into full-time consulting work, looking at the intersection of race and racism and workforce development, along with some other kind of factors, and supporting individuals and organizations who want to do the work in earnest. So I'm excited to be joining the conversation today and bringing all of that experience to this conversation.
Thank you so much, Claire. Michael, share a little bit about yourself.
Thank you so much, Marjorie, and thank you, Claire. I'm Michael Collins. I'm Vice President at Jobs of the Future. We're a national nonprofit. We're based in Boston and have satellite offices in DC and in Oakland, and we work to transform the American education and training system. And my role at JFF as Vice President of Programs is focused on looking at across JFF at our strategies and our interventions to identify which of those have efficacy for improving outcomes for Black learners and workers. That's a new role. Historically, I led the post-secondary state policy work at the organization for the last 15 years. And much of that work was focused on state and systems level policy and how we can design and create the conditions for success for students of color and low income students. And was very gratified to be able to work with 16 different states and their state community college systems on reforms that were designed to advance the completion and employment prospects of low-income communities and communities of color. Really terrific to be here with you today and to have this conversation at this really momentous time in our nation's history and major implications for our education and workforce development systems. So terrific to be with you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Michael. So our conversation is going to be very centered on how do you bring these large systems, together in a really strategic way to drive, social and economic mobility. So we're looking at, the platform of human services touching, millions of, families across the country, post-secondary workforce development, right? So all of these big systems that we know are fundamentally, pathways, if we, construct them correctly, pathways for economic mobility for families. And then how do you take a two-generation approach, recognizing that when you support the entire family, both the parents and the adults simultaneously, you're going to have better and stronger outcomes. And this, really intentionally has to have a strong racial equity lens. And Claire, both you and Michael, mentioned the importance of, equity and centering that in your work. And Claire, you mentioned that you are very focused on change levers and how equity can be centered in that. So I'd really like to hear from both of you. What are some of the strategies, practical strategies for, making certain that we are driving towards, equity, racial equity more in particular. So Claire.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the first, like any change effort, that right, personal or professional or systemic, we have to acknowledge that race and racism is real, one, and that it manifests in our systems too, and that it really impacts economic outcomes for communities of color, right? It is like the number one driver of outcomes for communities. And so if we are not acknowledging that reality, then we are not doing this work. So that's step one. Step two, then, I would say, is really acknowledging the role that our system, and so I will speak as a workforce practitioner, acknowledging the role that workforce development as a system has played in upholding, or to use Michael's language, actually reproducing racism via policies and practices and program design and implementation, right? So we cannot really get to change unless we understand the manifestations and how it's showing up in our systems and how those policies and practices are reproducing, supporting, or upholding the inequities that we see in the communities in which we serve, specifically for communities of color. And then after doing that examination, I would encourage, then you can really say, now where do we begin, right? We understand, we see it manifesting in our program design, we see it in our curriculum, we see it in our leadership structure. Which one of these do we want to tackle first? Or how do we prioritize that so that then we can get to action?
Yeah. Claire, do you have any advice on how people would prioritize? Once they examine, do you have like a practical step that would help people think about prioritizing? Because I know for a lot, we work with a lot of practitioners, and the one thing that they really want to know first and foremost is, how do you do this work? So any practical suggestions or recommendations?
Yeah, so there are tons of tools that can be really helpful. So there's the Racial Equity Impact Assessment by Race Forward. There's the 10 Essential Questions for Workforce Development, which I'm biased towards because I created.
And where might people find that?
www.abc-md.org.
Okay.
So the 10 Essential Questions for Workforce Development, I think, is a really good initial step to get folks thinking about the ways in which racism manifests across workforce program design and policies and even organizational operations, right? So first, let's understand how this is manifesting within our organization. And then from there, I think a few things have to happen before we take steps and even before we prioritize. One, we have to understand our local context. Two, so who are the players? Who are the influencers? Are folks ready for this conversation? Are they not? Two, is there anything that's quote unquote low hanging fruit, right? Is there anything on our list that we say, this doesn't require a whole lot of leadership or organizational buy-in to make this change? This is the right thing to do. Let's make this change, and identifying where those fall. I think we also need to consider, in terms of prioritization, impact. Which one of these is going to have, what level of impact is this change going to have, and how, and, how, over what period of time? So I hate giving the blanket answer, right? Folks typically want a roadmap, and it's like, all of these factors matter. And actually, that's a part of doing the work. Part of doing the work is slowing down to say, what are all the factors that contribute to this current inequitable system, right? And the inequitable outcomes. And then let's take a minute to assess, like, what are all the factors that are going to be required for us to move this work forward? It really is around organizing. It really is around the meeting before the meeting. And it really is then assessing, where can I make the most impact over what period of time? And sometimes that may be, something that's a lower hanging fruit, and sometimes that's a larger goal, and you need to pull in more partners. And so taking into consideration your local context, your local players, the influencers, and readiness for the work is really important to then deciding where you want to begin.
That's really helpful. I appreciate just kind of those resources that you shared, as well as like, how do you assess, within your own local context, what's important and who are partners. So, Michael, when you're thinking about this question of, centering equity, racial equity, and looking at, the post-secondary, system, higher ed, can you share some, thoughts and recommendations for how people can be thinking about and approaching this to drive economic mobility for families?
Absolutely. So first, I really appreciate Claire's comments. That's super helpful. And, as I think about the post-secondary system, I mean, Claire in some ways started with some level setting, and I think that we need to do some level setting. So number one, kind of college in our country, right? Like the post-secondary system is kind of seen as kind of a strategy for economic mobility. So college, there's a kind of mobility narrative. You go to college, you get a job, kind of you advance in the economy. And the fact of the matter is that is unfortunately a myth. I mean, it is a myth. I mean, so when you inject race into that narrative, into the college mobility narrative, it absolutely breaks down, right? So along the lines, as Claire said, we have to get really clear on race. We have to name it, right? If we're going to make the post-secondary system, if we're going to make college work. So I think, number one, acknowledging that. The second thing is we have to really interrogate so much of what we think about kind of post-secondary in college, even community college. It really stems from the ethos of what we think college is, right? So you think in your mind that red brick, those manicured lawns, you're really thinking about our nation's most elite institutions. And there's a lot of evidence that people extrapolate, kind of what those institutions do with what college can do, right? And when we look at the outcomes, that kind of generalization is absolutely not true. When we look at outcomes for open access, non-selective institutions, not to beat those institutions up, but the outcomes are dramatically different for those institutions. Those institutions typically receive much less funding, right? So they cannot support students as well as kind of some of the more selective institutions. And regrettably, our nation, when you look at the patterns of who is going to higher education, you see, white upper income families disproportionately represented in selective institutions, and people of color and low income people overrepresented in our nation's really open access institutions, our community colleges, and institutions that actually have less ability to serve. Now, this is not all bad. I just think that we have to level set to understand what we're dealing with. So the opportunity is that, kind of on average, post-secondary education, credentials pay off. The issue is that, most low-income people of color, when they are in higher education, they are typically more likely to be enrolled in a program that leads to low wages, right? So even when they complete, they are more likely to be in a program that does not pay as well, and they are, across all programs, they're more likely to be unemployed after graduation relative to their white peers, or underemployed, right? And so there's considerable work we have to do to, one, ensure that our post-secondary system is acknowledging kind of challenges and barriers based on demographics, based on who you are, right? It matters. And that we're helping students navigate kind of the barriers. We're helping them be smart about the potential payoff of different types of credentials. We're helping them be smart about the relationships that they need to build inside of the institution and outside to increase their probability of having information that can help them, kind of secure information about a job, or a job, that social capital piece. And I think that in our advising and counseling systems and in our career navigation systems, we really have to modernize them, to acknowledge that college and the mobility narrative, it's not race neutral. It's not race neutral. So how do we develop really a next generation counseling and advising system that helps people of color understand the opportunity, but also is sanguine about the barriers that have to be navigated to get to that opportunity? And so I think that that is both kind of the promise and challenge of post-secondary. This is the only system we have right now. So I'm not suggesting by any means, right, that we don't leverage this system. I think that I'm kind of acknowledging some of the challenges that we have to grapple with, right, to make this system work for the communities of color who, frankly, low-income people and communities of color who need the scaffolding and the system to work for them the most.
Very, very helpful to illuminate that, Michael. And it leads me to this question around where are there bright spots? Where is some of this working well? Because this effort, Boost, is about bringing together, human services and post-secondary systems, workforce and higher ed for better opportunities for families and towards economic mobility, right? So, Michael, where do you see there opportunities that this is working well, or is there a policy or practice that you think, could really fuel further expansion, of social and economic mobility for families across these three systems? Very powerful systems, right?
Absolutely. So first, let me just say, in terms of examples, I want to be really clear that there's been amazing work and kind of post-secondary reform that's happened over the last, decade and a half. So starting with initiatives like Achieving the Dream. So Achieving the Dream, it's a 501c3. There's an organization. Their colleges are doing amazing work. There have been subsequent initiatives that have built on each other, the lessons. So there, after Achieving the Dream, there was the Developmental Education Initiative and Completion by Design. And so today we're standing kind of on that evidence. There's a Student Success Center initiative, and there are 16 different states that are implementing, they're providing the colleges all across their states with supports to innovate. So many of that, a lot of that innovation is around guided pathways. So there are amazing examples that we can connect people with, and they're happening, across states. The one, I guess, caveat or thing I would encourage us to think about is, while existing strategies and institutions doing really great work is really important, as we know, our economy had a major disruption. COVID was a major disruption, and in many
continues to be,
right? I shouldn't talk about post-COVID like we're in it. It continues to be, and I raise that because it really put into sharp relief that our post-secondary education system and workforce development system were not connected, right? So, like, let's say you're in a post-secondary program, and it's you're going to work on an associate's or bachelor's degree. March happens, April happens, you're unemployed, right? And that long-term degree often was not connected to anything short-term, any skilling or, credentialing opportunity that you might have kind of been able to just kind of connect to while you try to wait for a job. So I think that while we want to identify successful practices, we're at a time of invention. And so as we think about kind of post-secondary institutions, partnering with whether it be community-based organizations or other nonprofits, I think now is a time, and why it's so important for this initiative, community colleges, in some ways, all institutions were forced to innovate. March came, and so there are opportunities to begin to sit down and design, right, for kind of the current system we have, not the system that we want to have.
Yeah, no, Michael, I just really want to, support and reiterate your points around, what has happened as a result of COVID. Yes, it has been a crisis, but when you look at the systems that are supporting families, many of them developed, very incredible innovations, as well as reinvented themselves to support more families in a more strategic way. And I think the human services field itself has really transformed in a way that I know a lot of leaders are thinking about, how do we not go back to that old system that we know was not working for families, right?
Yeah.
We definitely know. So, Claire, I wanted to ask you, when you're looking at, the workforce development system and across, where might you see bright spots, or are there particular policies or innovations that have surfaced that you would like to share with folks?
Yeah, so I think, there's momentum there's awareness and there's willingness. And I think with the combination of momentum, awareness, and willingness, there's really an opportunity in the true American fashion to capitalize on that. And really, one, continue and maybe expand the conversation around wages, right? Like we talk about living wages, but not really.
Yeah.
We talk about $15 an hour, but in what state of this country can we actually, can a family thrive off
on
of
$15? Yes.
Right. And so where are there groups of people and energy where we can have an honest conversation about what it requires to live? Because COVID, I'm like, what year is it? COVID-19 has really laid bare that we're not paying families, working families enough, right? A crisis hits, they don't have savings. Many folks, many of our workers in this field actually are part of that as well. And so how do we seize the moment to really talk about living wages and think about what are some strategies there? How do we seize the moment to, lots of employers made statements, right, that Black Lives Matter and they support racial equity and they recognize systemic racism. How do we use that as leverage to hold those employers accountable to changing workplace practices? There's an opportunity, I think, to think about our policies around the benefits cliff and how are we really supporting families and individuals, workers who need to, who have an opportunity to increase their income, but recognizing that that increase in and of itself is not enough to move them to stability. And so how do we extend those benefits to make sure that there's a period of time where those families can get to stability before those are cut off? When we think about workforce, program design, this is really an opportunity to embed a very race explicit framework into curriculum. And really, this connects to a point that Michael surfaced for me in his earlier comments. You know, we have been preparing individuals to enter predominantly white industries without naming the challenges and the barriers that they're going to have to navigate in those industries. How do we use this as an opportunity to say, look, this industry has amazing potential for high growth and high wage opportunities. But here are the very real dynamics that you will have to navigate as a person of color, or as a Black person, as a LGBTQIA member, right? How do we really seize the moment to be intentional in including those conversations in our training design? Because the reality is there's a navigation that's required. And if we are really going to disrupt the business as usual and inequitable workplace practices, we have to create a context in our training design really that allows workers and job seekers to come back to us. We navigate, we can then collect that data, use that data to go to our advocacy partners, right? Like we can think of using this information in much more strategic ways to really influence our employer partners and workplace practices so that we're acknowledging the experiences and honoring the experiences and then using that to change systems.
That is so important, Clara, and I appreciate your raising, just that and naming, the systems that are in place and how people enter in those systems. And Michael, just wanted to, lift up, you had mentioned earlier social capital and making certain that there is opportunity to build the social capital. And Clara, that's kind of connected to what you were saying as well. But one of the important things when you take a two-generation approach, when you're looking for stronger outcomes for the entire family, it has to be grounded in the voices of parents or the person that's being served. And I want to know from both of you, how do we structure these systems in a way in which we're getting the perspective of, the families or the individuals on the front end, like in the design of what's happening, on the implementation of what's happening. And then as Clara, you were suggesting, what are the feedback loops? How do we really know if any of these things are working? But, what are your thoughts on, kind of focusing this in a human-centered design way? We call it, centering it in the voices of parents, but thoughts on that? Michael?
Absolutely. So, you know, it's really, I think it's really sad that, what happened to George Floyd, right, has produced the outpouring and the opportunity for us to have these conversations. Like, it's like we should have been having these conversations
Yeah.
so long ago, right? And I say that because to answer your question, Marjorie, we actually need to center those communities, right? Those communities of color, because they haven't been central, right? Because when we talk about, even in post-secondary reform, education reform, when we talk about low income, central to that conversation is typically a white person, a white low income person, right? Like when we talk about these issues, I think we have to center the issue on the population. So when we do that, we may get some feedback and answers that we don't expect.
Right.
We assume that they want kind of the middle class outcomes that that we have, or like we're assuming that. Have we talked to them? Is that their goal? Is it their goal to get a post-secondary credential so they can get a job to move out of their community? We might find that that is actually that's not their goal. So
You're right.
I think centering the strategies, these systems, as we mentioned, these systems were not designed for these communities. And there's no way that we can back into that. There's no way to retrofit. The system was built, the 17th century model, we know what it was built off of, right? And so, and you see those elements to this day, right? The medieval clothes, I mean, even in community colleges, right? Like we have to, I think, talk with these communities about what they need, how they are experiencing our education and training systems, right? We need to help them navigate the incredible complexity of the system, right? So many of them are in post-secondary or they're in a workforce program, and they're very unclear on what the outcomes are going to be, the employment outcomes, and that's on the system, right? Like we have to, I think, do better in terms of kind of career navigation and counseling. And but I think it really does center on us having a conversation, which will be difficult to have because while it's wonderful that we can name this, there is a huge delta, right, between us as a society agreeing that we have to do something appreciably different, right? That the opportunity structure for these communities are different. And until we can get there, I think we will have to, continue our advocacy. But I do think that when you have a 1 to 10 wealth gap, black, white wealth gap, a black family, 17,000 versus 170,000, and then you say you both can go through our race neutral, and income neutral education system, post-secondary system, it just doesn't. It just doesn't add up, right? So anyway.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And we only have like 1 minute left. So Claire, I'd love to hear from you how to center the voices of participants or parents more particularly in these systems.
Yeah, I want to connect some dots really quickly, right? So this is where the narrative of the broken people versus broken systems manifests. System, right? So because we come from a place where people are broken and they need to be fixed, we don't recognize the inherent value and their humanity, right?
Yes, the resilience as well.
Because we don't recognize the skills that they're bringing to the table, we don't think that they have anything to offer to the situation. So we have to recognize that that's a narrative that has fed the system, right? It fed and leads to the outcomes. And then it manifests in our systems in that we do not create space for people to share and bring and to recognize the value that they have and the skills that they have inherent to them, and how that can add value to the work that we're trying to do. And if we really see ourselves as the social network really and the bridge, as I like to explain it, then I think we recognize that our role isn't to tell people what they need. Our role is to be a bridge because there's an opportunity gap, and we sit in a place where we can connect dots while we fix a system that really and truly hasn't been designed to serve them, right? So I love Michael's comments. We can't retrofit a system. The system is designed to do exactly what it has done and exactly what we see. Our job is then to not only support the individual, honor them, see our shared humanity while we're working on dismantling and disrupting these systems.
Great. Claire, Michael, what an amazing conversation. I feel like we've only scratched the surface and we could go so much deeper. I'd love to have another half an hour to talk more specifically about, the human services platform, right? These are billion-dollar, state agencies in every single state that partner very effectively with workforce development and higher ed all of the time. And as we were saying, these systems have to work with each other for stronger and better outcomes for families because, as one of our, parent advisors said, families aren't broken, these systems are broken, and we need to, better improve the alignment and outputs of those systems for families. So thank you so much for your time this afternoon. It's been a wonderful conversation, and I wish that we had more time together. Thank you.
Thank you.